Welcome to Chapter 2, The Rediscovery of Crime Victims for Victimology. The learning outcomes for this chapter include understanding the reform of the criminal justice system in the 20th and 21st century and how that impacts the victims, understanding the plight of victims which has been rediscovered by elected officials, the media, and criminal enterprises, describing behaviors under distress and what those look like, distinguish between the terms of victim and survivor, explain the possible roles of bystanders who witness a crime in progress, and then describe stages of the rediscovery process and discuss the rediscovery groups of victims in contemporary times. So as we look through the history of crime victims, one of the things that we learn throughout the chapter is that street crimes really pushed for the identification of victims for thousands of years. They really just looked at those street crimes. We weren't looking at anything else except for personal crimes against each other, like robbery, assault, things of that nature. Victims sought redress for pain and suffering based on religious values in the English common law, and industrialization and urbanization diminished the role of victims. So with that being said, we lost during these early colonial days, we lost the victim role and started focusing more on the offender. And then it says even over time, criminal courts focus on punishing wrongdoers and left victims damaged to recover civil courts. One of the things that we learn in a different class is that constitutional rights, those amendments, were not granted to the states until later on, like in 1868, I believe, is when those were finally granted to states. So really your constitutional rights were only based on government and not individual or personal crimes. So in early colonial days, victims conducted the investigation and paid for warrants for sheriffs to make arrests. They would hire private investigators. They would have to prove that something happened to them. And that's really how victims were represented within the criminal justice system, right? So that Constitution, when we're talking about the reconceptualization of crimes as hostilities against the state, we look at terms like public prosecutor, who took over the responsibilities of the victim. So the state, or what we like to say like with the DA, they represent the state or the victim if the victim has been wronged. And we started focusing more on the protection of criminal rights with that. And the violations of laws is more important than the harm to the victim. So basically putting the offenders away, looking at what rights are out there for the offender, and then thinking about the victim secondary. Plea negotiations or plea bargains, if you are unaware, 95% of cases in the United States are plead out for conviction rates. So one of the things you need to understand about this chapter is plea negotiations. What's the cost of the victims? Do we lose the voice of the victim? A lot of times in plea negotiations or plea bargains, we never even have to hear from the victim because it's done behind closed doors. They're going to plea out to a lesser charge in order to close the case. Okay, so looking at those, do we lose the voice of that victim in plea bargains? So the process of rediscovery, when we look at this in American history, the penal system focused on goals of rehabilitation of offenders and protecting society by deterring or arresting and incapacitating other would-be offenders. Victims once again began receiving attention only relatively recently. Okay, and some of these groups that have given, have had propelled the victims is going to be, shockingly, our elected officials, the media, and certain commercial enterprises. So it says that activists such as journalists, criminal justice officials, lawmakers brought the plight of crime victims to the attention of the public. These activists promoted the message that crime victims were forgotten figures in the criminal justice system and that their needs and their wants were systemically overlooked. Okay, so it was these areas, people advocating for the victim, and really we're just seeing that in like the 1960s, that era. Your book's going to talk about that civil rights era. Next, we look at victimology and how it contributes to the rediscovery process. So rediscovery is looking at victims that were always victims, but we kind of forgot about, okay? So what we notice is criminologists began researching victims around the 1940s. Criminology is the study of crime and how it occurs. It really looks more at the offender and why they offend. And then victimology was the first really to study vulnerable populations, women, minorities, how they are impacted by the criminal justice system. And then it says during the 1960s, street crimes intensified. We know this with the civil unrest of the nation. And then by the 1970s, victimology is recognized as a field of study. Victimologists gain insight into everyday life. What their goal is to solve puzzling and troubling issues, better appreciating life's outcome, seeing phenomena more clearly, and understanding complex situations more profoundly. This study can also shed light on how miscommunication, misunderstanding, desires, obsessions, demands, stereotyping, reckless behavior, and provocative acts can trigger harsh reactions that can lead to needless conflict and avoidable tragedies. Okay, so victimologists play a significant role within our criminal justice system. So it states that criminologists study victims at their worst, and then victimologists study victims at their most vulnerable part, right? So under those terms of distress, if you're a victim and you are being robbed or sexually assaulted under duress or potentially attacked, they're looking at two different things here. Victimologists can create a safe, effective way of responding to attacks by allowing people that are going to interview victims or deal with victims, providing education for them. So what do those victimologists do? They're going to study this behavior after harm is inflicted, and they are going to advocate for resiliency with those victims and serve as a possible role model for our victims. It says victimologists can take part in furtherizing positive development and constructive activities when they seek to discover effective ways of coping with hardship, transiting adversary, reimbursing financial losses, speeding up the healing process, promoting reconciliation between parties, and then restoring harmony to strife-torn communities. So what's the difference between victimology and survivorology? This is a term in your book. It says that many victims prefer the more positive term of survivor. In chapter 1, we learned that the term victim a lot of the times is associated with negative labels or negative attitudes. And so the term survivorologist or survivorology is going to refer to more positive or upbeat labeling for our victims. Okay, survivorology focuses on personality traits, inner resources, and self systems. It's going to talk more about that resiliency and how the victim overcame. It allows victims to reconsider priorities, permits a return to a previous or better life, allowing these victims to take control of the situation. We also have term bystanderology. So many of you might have heard of the Good Samaritan laws that we have that state that if you see somebody in duress, if you see somebody hurt, if you act in good faith and you can't save that person, there's laws that are going to protect you that said, I tried, right? Good Samaritan. And it goes back to the biblical days, in one of the stories in the Bible about a Samaritan helping somebody that got beat up, right? So when we look at that, we look at bystanderology, which involves the criminals, the victims, and a third party, right? The bystander that's watching the situation happen. So unfortunately, with technology, with cell phones, with cameras, all these things, what we're understanding is that a bystander can ignore that crime or they can engage, right? If they see something happening, they have free will. Do they intervene or do they not? Okay. What we do know is the bystander effect happens. Okay. The more the bystanders, the more the crowd, the more the people, the more likely it's going to increase that nobody is going to step in. Okay, we're not going to have those good Samaritans. It says that the increase at likelihood of intervention is going to decrease. Time it takes for somebody to intervene increases, and the assistance required for the victim request, right? So we are seeing videos after videos on the news of people literally filming people getting beat up, mugged, abused, and then are standing there filming it, right? So that bystanderology of do we intervene, do we not? In most all states are going to have a Good Samaritan law that says if you do intervene, the law is going to be on your side. But the more bystanders, the less likely that that victim is going to get help. So when we're looking here at the rediscovery process moving forward, the law and order movement, which was a reaction to rising crime in the 1960s, this movement embraced the crime control model of criminal justice, which means that we're going to regulate criminal behavior based on increasing our laws and our penalties. So what we saw was a crackdown on social and political deviance, mass incarceration or lockup of criminals quickly and for longer periods of time. We see this really in the 1980s with our drug laws. And then fewer loopholes for those attorneys. Next, we see the women's movement. We see a focus on females harmed by males and not provided support by male-dominated criminal justice systems. So we start advocating more of that female victimization. We start changing laws that include anti-rape laws, anti-battering campaigns. We form rape crisis centers, battered women's shelters. We started changing definition of rape. So in the state of North Carolina, for instance, it used to be lawful for a husband to rape a wife. That was not against the law. That was changed. And so, this movement of women's rights started seeing women in a victimologist light. The civil rights movement focus on opposing racist stereotypes and discrimination. So this really, like the 1960s back, but we started looking at biased crimes. So things that we saw in the criminal justice system was like racial profiling, pulling over people because they might be black or Hispanic, and not pulling over the same amount of white people. And then even today, in your guys' time, we see activists promoting things like Black Lives Matters, right? When we see infamous crimes like the George Floyd case, that, we need to have equality within our races. That's our civil rights. Hate crimes fall into this. We started defining what a hate crime is based on sex, race, gender, ethnicity, religious background. All of that started changing. And then other social movements. So we saw civil liberties movement, higher education and training required for police officers. As a person that taught within the police academies, we are definitely seeing this with larger cities, with municipalities requiring longer training sessions, requiring some police officers to not only have police training, but higher education, a 2-year degree, a 4-year degree, in order to combat the legality or, just have better trained officers out there. Then we have children's rights groups, elder abuse, gay rights, LGBT rights, self-help movements. We even start looking at social movements like prisoners' rights. We have the 8th Amendment. So prisoners still get rights even if they're incarcerated. They're still people, and they still get rights based on living in America. So there's a couple of legislations here that it talks about. During the 1980s, we started seeing proposing and enacting pro-victim legislation. We have the Brady Bill, the Clary Act, which this impacts your campus security and requires crime statistics to be published for all colleges in the nation. Here at Mars Hill or any school that you've been to, they are required by law now to submit to the public the crimes that have occurred on the campus. But remember, they only can report to the public what has been reported to them. Okay, we see the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd hate crimes prevention, and the Megan's Law, Kate's Law. The Brady Bill is what I want to talk about. That it's the Handgun Violence Protection Act. It's to protect individuals from being harmed by guns. Then we have the Megan's Law, which comes out of New Jersey. And so what this does is state and counties also enacted laws named after their victims. So Megan was a victim, and what this does is require and mandate sex offenders to register within their local police department and the communities residents to be notified of those. So if you've ever seen a sex offender registry, or if you go and you look up your address in the town that you live in on one of these state registries, it'll show you all the sex offenders that live within your area. Okay, so that's the Megan's Law. Then we have a new one. It's a little controversial, but it's called Kate's Law, and it's stiffened penalties for convicted and deported criminals who enter the United States illegally. So obviously Kate was a victim, and she was killed by an illegal immigrant who entered the country illegally and ended up committing a crime. So what this law does, and what's a little controversial, is that it enforces stiffer penalties for people that are here illegally that commit a crime. Okay. So looking at the media and how they're portraying the victim's plight, you can either be pro-media, you can be anti-media. Sometimes they do great, sometimes they don't, okay? So that's what it's going to say. The media, a lot of the times, will advocate or make known that somebody's a victim before anybody else, okay? So your book is going to say that, we should give credit to the media for rediscovering victims. It says in the past, offenders received the majority of media coverage, right? The offender. But now those on the receiving end of criminal behavior are no longer invisible or forgotten, right? They're telling the story of the victim, not just focusing on that offender. It says details about injured parties are routinely included in coverage to inject some human interest into the crime story. In highly publicized cases, interviews carried out by journalists have enabled victims to have a voice in how their cases are resolved in court and about the issues of the importance of victims and other concerned about crime in our society. Okay, so they give that. And it allows the victim to tell their story to the public, okay? However, it says that the media sometimes clashes with victims' rights to privacy. Victims, we'll learn, have a whole document that says what their rights are, and they do have the rights to privacy, but a lot of times with bigger cases we see that those victims' names are published, okay, and then that takes away their privacy. And so we see things like these laws enacted to help protect the identity of that victim, self-restraint of reporters and editors that might leak information when they're not supposed to, and code of professional conduct for the media, okay? It reins them in. So commercial interests. Can consumers help? Can they exploit? Yes. Right? So when we're looking at commercial interests, they also have benefits and drawbacks for victim movements. The emerging market of protective services and anti-theft devices meets consumers' needs, but also can exploit the market through fear-mongering and false advertising. Right? So victimologists must represent the public interest and demand proof of product service claims. Therefore, if there is somebody out there, commercial business, that is selling something that is supposed to protect the victim. So think about now in the world of Ring cameras, or back in the day, I can remember they sold these devices that basically locked your wheel of your car, the inside the steering wheel, so that even if they broke into your car, that they couldn't steal your car, right? Because that device was there. Unfortunately, the commercial business knows who the victims are, and they're going to use that for profit, okay? So there is a whole thing. Yes, they're validating the victimization, but at the same time, they're profiting from that victimization. Additional groups of victims. So when we come down through here and we're looking at who can become a victim, what we're starting to see is receiving studies and support for abused children, battered women, people killed by drunk drivers, school shootings. Those are targets right now. We're seeing tons of academic research, scholarly journals, scientific evidence that's validating these top populations here, right? These studies are supporting those victims. However, we're still lacking, right? So things that we're waiting on, that there's not a lot of academic support out there, are disabled victims, homeless victims, delivery drivers. Do you ever think of delivery drivers being victims? That's kind of like one of those rediscovered populations. In class the other day, I talked about cruise ship individuals, people that decide to go on cruises, is a huge victimization population that people really haven't discovered. It's just hit and miss. If you have a subscription to like Hulu or maybe Netflix, I can't remember what it's on, Cruise Ship Killers. It's a whole show based on murder victims from cruise ships. Okay. So delivery drivers, immigrants as victims. Okay. Oops. Okay, the next few slides here, it starts talking about the process of rediscovery and the stages or the steps to discover those victims. So stage 1 here is calling attention to an overlooked problem, right? Activists raise public consciousness to a situation. Self-help groups form, coalitions form, and then we start seeing the social construction of the problem, claims making. So the first stage is calling attention to the actual problem. Who's the problem? So if we're looking at delivery drivers, oh, that's a problem, right? They're being victimized. Stage 2, making progress, implementing reform. So may require pilot programs to prove need. These could be case studies. These could be longevity studies. We also need to secure government and private funding in order to fund these projects. Other agencies copy successful models and take over some of the responsibilities for this. It says, for instance, after activists create shelters and rape treatment centers, some local governments began funding safe houses where women and their children could seek refuge, and hospitals organized their own 24-hour rape lines, crisis lines, things like that. It says best example, MADD, that is Mothers Against Drunk Driving, right? That's a whole movement of mothers that lost their children to drunk driving. It is an advocacy that started with moms, and now we're seeing them progress, right? And they actually are implementing reform. Stage 3, emergence of an opposition and development of resistance, right? This is that critics part of it. They argue. So what we see is critics argue that changes from stage 2 have gone too far or are too one-sided and do not benefit societal majority. So what it's saying is, yes, we find a victim population, we advocate for it, we need reform. Stage 3, it becomes society as they're starting to realize that this might be a problem. But then stage 3, we start seeing those critiques. Okay. Interests are too one-sided, threats are overestimated, they are ignoring if the victim is culpable, and then false memory syndrome. Okay, false memory syndrome is, did you remember it correctly, right? Are we remembering what's implanted in your memory or something that you actually remember? I always like to talk about my children here because they'll say, oh, I remember that. And I'm like, you were like 18 months old. You remember the picture because you've seen it so much, and now we've implanted that memory into you, but you don't actually remember that firsthand. It's a false memory syndrome. And then we have stage 4 here that it starts talking about research, finding, generate useful evidence. So we start collecting data, analysis. We want to put the public's fear into perspective, attempt to resolve ongoing controversies, assess the impact of countermeasures for victims, prevent others from victimization. That's the end goal always in victimology. And then sometimes the victimization recede from public concern and reemerge. And then we start the 4th stage process anew with that. So, rediscovering, when we get back up here, when we're trying to rediscover a victim population or reintroduce it as a problem, there's going to be some pushback, okay? You will definitely see this within this class. So that covers, I think, all 30 slides and our lecture time. If you have any questions or concerns about this chapter, let me know.